Hello, Ian.
Hello, Alex. How wonderful to be with you in person.
Indeed, yeah, after this
Yes.
long, beautiful journey together,
Yes.
we
Thank you
finally
for
meet.
coming all this way.
Yes, my pleasure.
Yes.
So we've done together the 28 chapters of your book,
Yes.
which, if you multiply the amount of minutes we've talked, is about the number of pages of the book. I've estimated that.
Right.
And so we finished this journey by
Yes.
meeting in person.
Yes, that's very good.
And we're going to discuss the epilogue
Yeah.
and whatever else we feel like
Yes.
about the matter with things and beyond. Okay.
Indeed.
So I wanted to start by just back to the coda, to part 3, where, and I know we need not do a summary, and by the way, that's what you say at the beginning of the epilogue, that some readers may rush to the end of a book or a novel to see what happened.
Yeah.
But that's not, and you speak about the loyal reader who made it all the way. But in any case, perhaps we could recapitulate what you write in the coda to part 3 about the pathways and the portals, and your argument plus evidence plus a worldview that you offer.
Yes.
It's the right time to do so, maybe.
Well, you have to remind me what I wrote in
Well,
the coda to part 3, but it was some way of summarizing the drift of...
Yeah, so basically we've had these portals.
Yes.
You've offered these
Yes,
portals,
yes.
and you've talked about attention,
Yes.
central one,
Yes.
and perception and intelligence and so on,
Yes.
and creativity. And then the pathways,
Yes.
which is kind of a quadruple helix in a way.
Yes.
Science and reason and imagination and
Intuition.
And in part 3, you've used that to offer a view of the cosmos,
Yes.
and you've dealt with matter and
Yes.
time, and so that's a whole argument with evidence that
Yes.
ends up offering a philosophy of life and perhaps for life.
That's a lovely way of putting it. I think some people have noticed that I quote a lot of philosophers, but that I don't go into any one philosopher in very great detail. Probably there are one or two people like Whitehead and William James that I do talk about more than others, but that I'm not writing philosophy in the way that many people think of it, as expounding the work of a philosopher of the past, but instead saying we can start from a different kind of first principles, which are how the brain helps us construct whatever it is that we experience as reality. And I'm really saying, so if we look at that, the portals and how they differ between the two hemispheres, the pathways and the contribution to the two hemispheres, what does the world look like when we apply this knowledge, this understanding of how it is that we know the world, to what that world is and is like? And so it is, in a way, an attempt to produce a new philosophy of life and of a way of living. That's absolutely right, because I think values are incredibly important. We'll probably come on to talk about that. And so it may be frustrating for some people that I don't delve further into particular philosophers. But what I've found is the many, many resonances in philosophers, great philosophers of all traditions, going back to the pre-Socratics, forward to the 20th century phenomenologists, and then also strands from other cultures.
Yes. The 3 Ps, I remember: pragmatism, phenomenology, and process philosophy.
Yes. The 3 Ps, yes, that's right, yes.
And in a way you also acknowledge, but maybe it's a too humble claim, that there's nothing new, but there is, right, in weaving this vision of the world together.
I hope so, because as I say, I'm bringing things together, none of which individually is possibly new, but that make a new whole.
Yes.
And I really think that that is what philosophy and art and the business of living and trying to achieve some degree of understanding of the world is about. It's about seeing a new whole, a gestalt, a form, which when perceived, the test is, do people go, aha? And people do.
Yes.
So that is pleasing and to a degree validating.
And there's a degree of an analysis there, of course, in realizing how each hemisphere contributes, making the distinction and weighting them. So there's also an analytical work there that helps the synthesis, right?
There's an enormous amount of analytical work. And, once again, one of the misconceptions one has to dispel all the time is that somehow I think there's something wrong with analysis or the work of the left hemisphere. I don't think I would do a better job if I'd had my left hemisphere ablated.
Yes.
Is very important, but it's just that it must always be in this position of serving the master, the right hemisphere, that sees more and understands more.
Yeah. This is a constant danger I felt while reading the book on myself and also probably on your part writing it, which is that it's clearly left hemispheric as well. And now, because of your work being more popular, I start to hear maybe too often kind of a critique like, oh, that's the left hemisphere. But that what they mean sometimes is, well, we're giving it too much thought.
Yes.
But it's not that we're talking about. Of course, that's absolutely necessary, and to go beyond. So it's not to stop before thought, but to see where are its limits and then go beyond.
That's right. I mean, the thing that I struggle with, I suppose, is because it's easy to accuse me of all sorts of... I mean, people say, you personify the hemispheres. Well, yes, I do to an extent, because we're talking here about elements of human experience, human cognition, human will, human imagination. And it seems to me that in order to describe these differences, one's faced with either doing so in human terms or in mechanical terms. And of course the convention is to do it in entirely mechanical terms. But I don't think that that's good enough. I just don't think it meets the phenomena at all. And so inevitably one humanizes them a bit. But I've also noticed that in many traditions from the ancient world, from the East, and from people like David Bohm, physicist of the last century, there is a feeling that there are drives here. I haven't talked about this much. I did a little bit in The Master and His Emissary, and I haven't accentuated it here. But there is something that seems to have a life of its own, that wills certain things. And those things are destructive. And it's, I mean, people are not happy to hear things like this because it can't be accounted for entirely in mechanical terms. But it's rather like my belief that evil is not simply an absence of good, but has a kind of drive, a spirit, an animus of its own. And it's quite clear that Christ himself thought that this was the case. He asked us to pray not just to be better than we are, but to resist the temptations of evil. So I think, and he himself, according to the Bible, for what that is worth, was tempted by the devil. So I think that there are forces in that. I think we all experience them that attract us as much as drive us. I mean, I don't know whether it's at this... my feeling is that this is a force of attraction for some people towards a certain kind of thing, call it power, call it eventually evil, because it will destroy. And David Bohm talks about thought, which is very interesting. And by thought, what he's clearly referring to, because of the way he talks about it, and I quote it in the epilogue, is what I would call the left hemisphere at work. And one of the points he says is that it claims it's doing nothing at all. It's just allowing things to be, and it has no drive, no end in sight. But that this is not the case, that we think that we are in control, but it is running us, he says.
Yeah.
Thought is running you. You think that you are in control of thought, but thought is running you. Now, I mean, that idea resonates enormously with these powerful images, some of which I've described. The image from The Secret of the Golden Flower of the general who is peremptory and arrogant and thinks that he should be the one who makes the ultimate decisions, not the emperor. It is there in the North American Onondaga myth with which I open the third part of the book. And it's also there in Milton's Paradise Lost. I mean, this is a story about the brightest and best of the angels, the second in command of the divine army, if you like, who through a kind of drive for power of his own sets about opposing and destroying what has been created. So I think this is a very deep perception, and people can huff and puff and say what they like about it, but I don't want entirely to gloss that over.
Yes, it's good you mentioned this, and I want to hear more about it, because one of the questions I had in this for this special occasion was, well, you end chapter 28 saying, well, I have nothing to add. And it makes sense after so long. But still, there may be things you would want to say after having written the matter, with things that continue the work of the book. And what you just mentioned seems not only to be one more interesting thing, but something absolutely crucial that has to do with this oracular, not prophetic, but oracular warning that you bring back to us again. I mean, this is the most, in a way, scary thing of the whole book to me, when you write, well, this has happened once, twice, and we've been warned that if it happens a third time, maybe we won't make it. And it's happening, and it's happening perhaps stronger than the first two occasions.
Yes. And those first two occasions you're referring to are the downfall of the Greek and the downfall of the Roman civilizations, which I attempt to outline in the second part of The Master and His Emissary, my earlier work. And you're picking up on the Onondaga myth, where the good brother, as it were, says, I can help twice, but the third time you will be lost. And that's at least a possibility that's worth bearing in mind. We need our minds sharpening, because the left hemisphere is not just in some metaphorical way, but literally in the lab, in the hospital. The left hemisphere, left to its own, is absolutely oblivious to, and worse than that, will positively deny things that it must know. And I think that's the situation that we now find ourselves in, where we are actually blind to things that are happening very fast and are of ultimate importance if we're going to survive, certainly as a civilization and quite possibly as a species.
There are concepts, but you seem to be talking about some sort of entities. It's like these ideas are not just ideas, right?
No. But then perhaps there's a problem in thinking always in terms of ideas. Ideas are terribly important. I spent my life with them, and my books are full of them, of course. But there's more to that, isn't there? I mean, life is an embodied business in which emotion, the body, intuition, imagination, feeling, and the intellect work together, and it's been part of the drive of my two major works, the Master's Emissary and this book, The Matter with Things, to suggest that we have become lopsided in the way in which we think. We think that all things can be solved almost as though they were equations. Somewhere I say life is more like a dance than an equation. So I think that's an important idea. And the prophetic and, I think, deeply spiritual poet Rilke, I quote this amazing poem about how the machine, when it comes to inhabit our minds, it says it's doing nothing. It's exactly like David Bohm. I mean, there's no way the two of them would have known one another. But he says the same thing, that it says it's just quietly getting on with its business, but it's actually destroying beauty and destroying life. So there's something there that, however you express it, and I hope people can forgive me for not being able to articulate it perfectly in everyday language, but I think I've hinted at it in many parts of the book. I've elaborated how that can be substantiated intellectually. And of course there are all these images which come from myths, from religion, from the arts, from music, from painting, from poetry, that give us intuitions that there is something here that is just more than us getting it slightly wrong.
Not only you triangulate from physics and from neurology and from philosophy, but from really many different traditions. That's something that's also very valuable about, because you could have done it just from the perspective of a Western mind, but you systematically incorporate Judaism and of course Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, and also the North American. And by the way, this is about stories. You were saying a few minutes ago. I heard recently somebody saying, well, we are telling stories all the time, and I don't want to make this into a competition, but we need to tell the best story we can
Yes.
and embody it. So
Yes,
that could be another way to rephrase what your 1,000 and so pages do. They tell the best story
Yes.
you can find, and it's a call to embody that story.
That's right. I think I say in the epilogue that the vision that I give could be said to be a myth. And I say, but that doesn't actually deliver the knockout blow that it's hoped that it might deliver, because we're not able to think at all or live our lives without a myth. And those people who think they have no myth have simply embraced the myth of the moment, which is the myth of the machine, so comprehensively that they're not aware that they have it. So there isn't an alternative not to have a myth. There's only an alternative to have a better myth. Or, of course, a worse one.
Yeah.
But what I'm hoping to give is a better myth that, if lived, and that, of course, is the proof of any of these things. It's the proof of the pudding, as we say, is in the eating. It's a matter of attempting it, absorbing it into your life, and seeing how it changes things. And I think that's a perfectly valid way to think about it.
Let's go back to truth, because that myth is truer, certainly,
Yes.
than...
Well, you know that anciently in Greece there were thought to be two kinds of truth, mythos and logos. And with time, logos overtook mythos, but initially mythos was thought much more important because it dealt with the things that simply can't be easily expressed in any other form. And we all know from experience, whether we're physicists, philosophers, or neuroscientists, that there are things here that cannot be easily put into words. The thing is far too great. This is the whole realm of our spiritual and imaginative life that can't be pinned down and put into everyday prose, or at least if we make the attempt, we vitiate what we're doing. We help to undermine it and to destroy it. So this kind of thinking is an important element. I'm not saying, of course, because my book is full of, as people are constantly pointing out, science and logic. I have nothing against science and logic. My argument is that our science is not scientific enough. In other words, it has too much dogma in it. I ask not that we disregard science, but we pay it due respect when it does what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't try to do things that science simply cannot do. And good scientists recognise there are things that are properly beyond the reach of science. It's only people who have what we call scientism who believe naively that everything can be reduced to science. It can't. And I feel the same about reason, that reason is terrifically important, but as Pascal pointed out, reason is feeble if it doesn't actually accept that there are things that lie beyond the grasp of reason.
Yes.
All the most important things do.
Yeah, the recognition of limits and cherishing that recognition is an integral part of your message. So let's continue talking about the unmaking of the world. This triple unmaking, which has to do with our relationship with nature, with our relationship to other human beings, and with our relationship to God.
Yes.
Some people may like to say the sacred, but we can say God.
Yes.
And how you're right, how we've been divorced and indifferent into these three realms. And again, I see your work and your book as a restoration of this triple unmaking of the world.
Well, it would be wonderful if we could go some part of the way to doing that. But there are major concerns, and it's really extraordinary that in such a short period of time, really probably 250 years, 300 years at the most, we have, for the first time in the history of the world, brought about an enormously powerful repudiation of and divorce from these three things that are not just, in my opinion, important, but can be demonstrated empirically, have been enormously deeply researched. These elements of relationship to nature, relationship to one another in a cohesive society, and relationship to the realm of the sacred or divine, these three things are central to human flourishing in every respect. in terms of obviously mental health and well-being, but also interestingly physical health and well-being, and also cognitive ability. The lives that we live, which are very unusual, very stressful, very artificial, cause mental illness. And that's again not just an opinion. It can be very well validated, and the data show that, of course, we're familiar with the idea that perhaps in the past people didn't diagnose things in the same way, and the retrospectoscope can distort. All of that is fine, but we have data in which, for example, school children at a certain age are simply asked to answer questions about their lives and their feelings, and we have these going back to the 20s or 30s of the last century through to the modern period, and what these show is that they express anxiety, depression and loneliness at a level diagnosable, so this is all objectively diagnosable on the accepted criteria, 4 or 5 times as high as when these records started to be kept in the 20s and 30s. So have we made the world a better place? I know there are very obvious ways in which we haven't. We know about the environment, and we know about what I would say nature, and we know about the other things that are missing from our lives, but just simply on the basis of mental health.
And on that line you also dwell on the word belong, or at least I do. Belonging and
Yes.
be and long,
Yes.
in bringing this relationship back to where it used to be,
Yes.
in these 3 fronts.
And what I'd say about that is belonging is related to longing. And both of them go back to an Anglo-Saxon word, langian, which means to stretch out. And so what one is talking about here is a sense of something where there is a connection, but it is stretched out, perhaps abnormally stretched out, so that you feel the connection, yet you feel the distance. And that is the root of longing. And it's also the root of the sense of having lost one's belonging, where one belongs.
Yeah.
And I think, I know John Vervaeke talks about, he uses a technical term, I can't remember what it is, but does he talk about domicide or something? I don't know, but what he's basically talking about is the rupture from the sense of a home where we belong. And the world is much more than just a heap of things, even if we include the entire living world. It is what we stem out of, it's what we return to, and it is the ground of our existence.
Yes, when you speak about Mother Nature,
Yes.
as a mother, even as a lover, I would say, but also as a home.
Yes.
And then there's this sense of orphanhood,
Yes,
right?
yes.
This belonging has been
Yes.
severed in a way, and
Yes.
we don't know where we belong. Where is our home?
That's right. And mammals bond as much with their nests as they do with their mothers. So imagine what this means. It's a kind of matricide that's happened across certainly the industrialized world, in which we've become orphans.
Yeah.
Yes.
The recurring question, right? But who are we?
Yes.
We cannot answer that question after having divorced ourselves from nature, other humans and other organisms, and God.
Well, I think we're at an absolute loss to know what we're doing here. I mean, I think nowadays nobody has the foggiest idea what life is about, who they are, or what the world is. And we think we've made such advances, but so many thinkers of the past were so much wiser than we were about these things. As soon as one starts, unfortunately, I didn't belong to an era of great sort of upheaval in education. We carried on learning the things that I think everyone should know, of history, of philosophy, and so on. When one is attentive to what one might call the ancestral, which in most cultures other than ours is also a very important way of thinking. If one actually attends with respect to what people have seen and known, one realizes that one would be very well advised to get to know what was said and done before rejecting it.
Yeah. Remembering is also...
Remembering it, yes.
Yeah. Now, that's one part of the subtitle of your book, right? The Unmaking of the World.
Yes.
Which I must admit, before reading the book, I thought you were trying to unmake the world, given how given the bad state
bad job we've done of it.
in which it is, but
Yeah.
it's the unmaking in these three senses we've discussed. There's another key idea there in the subtitle, which is our delusions.
Yes.
And I wanted to contrast it with hallucinations, because as you
Okay.
know,
Yeah.
we live in this, well, we don't live in this world, but in a way, mainstream neuroscience particularly is pushing this idea that these worlds are, whatever world we're talking about, is hallucinated.
Yeah.
But you say it's delusional, and delusion here is
Yes.
the error of making this flip between the master and his emissary. So I thought it's
Yes.
interesting to hear that word, delusional, and not so much hallucination.
Well, of course, delusions and hallucinations to some degree overlap. False, incorrigible false beliefs can give rise to experiences, and experiences can give rise to beliefs based on those experiences. So they do interrelate, but as I demonstrated very clearly, and I don't think it's ever been noticed to the same degree or at all, early on in the book, is the astonishing way in which all the really florid delusional syndromes that are known to neuropsychiatrists are very largely dependent on damage to the right hemisphere, or under hypofunction of the right hemisphere, not of the left. And where there are delusions based on damage or hypofunction of the left hemisphere, they're usually much less bizarre, much less extreme, and very short-lived. So there is something, I quote other neurologists who've said that the left hemisphere is frankly deluded, and so those words are not just mine. And this is very clearly the case when people have right hemisphere damage. They believe the most extraordinary things. I've mentioned them before, so I won't go through them again. But those who are interested, just look at, I think it's chapter 2, probably, and chapter 3 of the Matter with Things. And our perception of the world is something that can be seen in two different ways. Perception as immediate precognitive impact of whatever is around us on us, and that's what's normally meant by perception. But then we have in common parlance, my perception of things, which is an interpreted whatever. That interpretation by the left hemisphere is that whatever it sees is just a representation. Mm-hmm. And, I've made it before, but I'll make it again. There is a vast difference between the presence of something and its representation, which means literally being made present again after the fact when it's no longer present. And this difference is exemplified by people with schizophrenia who have left hemisphere overdrive and right hemisphere hypofunction, who not infrequently think that everything around them is play acting, that it's not real, it's just a representation that's set up. And so patients describe going to a railway station, seeing all the passengers as actors who are playing the part in a thing that had been set up for them. Yes. Or in the hospital, the doctors and nurses they're really actors who are playing doctors and nurses, not really doctors and nurses. So everything is not real, but just us. A representation, like an image. And a lot of what neuroscience is now saying seems to me dangerously close to setting up the idea, which the left hemisphere already has, that it lives in this enclosed space, and it projected on the walls of this room in which the homunculus is living are images of the world outside. But what I say is no, we have imperfect but nonetheless direct perception of reality, and the loss of that sense is very, very important to our predicament.
Yes.
And what I emphasize is something quite hard to articulate, but I'll attempt to do it briefly, which is that the partial nature of our understanding is not that we go part way towards something. We go all the way towards it, but we only get part of the whole picture. And then I refer, sorry to repeat myself, to this wonderful Japanese Zen garden called Ryoanji, in which there are 15 stones, but from any one place in the garden, the most you can see is 14. So what we are able to do in this world is to see something which is mine, but it's not just made up by me, and it's part of another reality. Importantly, it's not just my projection onto reality. That is so important, because as long as neuroscience goes along with this postmodern idea that it's simply made up, then actually one can verify nothing. It brings science to an end, it brings reason to an end, because after all, if it's all just made up by me, why are we bothering to have this conversation? Why doesn't one just jump off a cliff tomorrow? Because it doesn't mean anything.
Well, it's even more confusing than that, because they will claim that, and at the same time say there's an objective world out there, and they will add that these hallucinations are controlled so that, you know, we don't die. So they'll throw in the pudding a bit of evolutionism, and a bit of virtual worlds, and then they end up claiming that this reality plus is more real than reality, but nevertheless it's not quite real. So that's what's totally again confusing, and why I want to make the distinction between these control hallucinations and the delusion of having swapped the hierarchy. That leads to believe indeed that the world, or what we perceive as the world, is just, it's nothing but a controlled hallucination, and that from the beginning avoids the possibility of a direct encounter.
I think that the image is incoherent, actually, as incoherent as the idea that consciousness is an illusion. An illusion is something that happens in consciousness. That's what an illusion is. And whatever this thing is that we're experiencing, it has its roots in, even these people suggest, in some sort of reality. Well, what is the meaning of that reality if it's trumped by something that's simply made up? So why are we calling that reality? What is meant by reality here?
And truth, again.
Well, yes, and truth, of course, is about a relationship, and you know, that is within the concept of being true to an idea, true to a reality, true to something. And at the core of the business of life is our need to be faithful to something beyond ourselves. The intellectual striving of a philosopher to be true, to find truth, is also that of making a relationship to something other than just himself.
And we've said this many times, but I think it's valuable to repeat it, this idea of truth as some sort of trust towards the real. I don't know, maybe calling it faith is too much, but it's really a feeling of trust, a disposition of trust towards the real.
It is a disposition, but as I've said before, it's not a blind one. It's not the idea of blind trust or blind faith. It's something that comes from experience, where what one knows, what one has been through in life, it tells one something that makes sense and coheres. And so there are things that are more trustworthy than others. And the difficulty is that often people jump to conclusions and invent theories rather early on in their experience of life, and then are reluctant to let go of them, because they're the ones that, as it were, the workshop in which they work, the people who work there share. If you're in a science lab, then you're indoctrinated into a certain, in my view, rather simple vision of how the world is made and what it is. And it's very difficult to resist that as your career progresses, because everything can be lost by doing so. Yes,
a different kind of belonging, right? A familiarity that traps you there.
That's a good point, because as I say in the Master in Chemistry, there's two meanings of the word familiar. There's the one in which it is the root is the Latin word familia, which meant one's household, actually, not just one's blood kin, but also those who lived in the house. And that is a very important lived kind of familiarity. And then there's the familiarity of a cliche, which is dead. So it's either hypervital or dead. And so there are these two meanings, what the French call faux amis. You know, they sound the same, but they're not.
Now let me speak about the kind of maneuvers. So one is, you propose, one is to stretch, and we've mentioned that, is stretching towards, and with the goodwill and the good disposition of a proper encounter. And another one is this inversion of values, which
Yes,
may
yes.
sound like the easiest of
Yes,
solutions,
yes.
which is multiply by -1. Why is it so hard? Because at the end, in the epilogue, you spend some time talking precisely about we have everything upside down. So what could be the way forward? Well, to just put it again where it was. So it's just multiply the hierarchy by we've inverted by -1.
Yes.
It's not that easy.
No, it's not that easy, because values, whether we know it or not, enter into every single thing we do, including, of course, into science, which claims to be value-free. One of the things it values above all else is the absence of anything personal. And there are reasons for that, good reasons for that, but it also creates a way of relating to the world and understanding the world that is bound to have serious limitations in what it can tell us. So values permeate what we experience. I've always said that attention creates the world, and that attention is not some simple cognitive function, but is the ground of everything that we experience. And the nature of that attention is critical. And of course I talk about this in both books, and very early on in The Matter with Things. The way we attend to something changes what we find. And the values that we hold change what it is we think we see. And what happens is that when you pay attention in a certain mode, certain things will come to stand forward and be obvious. Other things will recede. And so you see something and you think, okay, that kind of attention seems to work. And so you pay it again the next time. And all the parts that were made to recede have no chance, as this process goes on, to be available to you unless you have a complete shift of perspective. And I believe all the great changes, the great insights, the creative moves in science and philosophy have come from a kind of complete shift in the way in which we look at things, a gestalt shift above all. And so values are very difficult, because we're often not aware of what our values are, and we're also unable to see how to shift them, because the more you adopt a certain set of values, the more the world you see corresponds to those values, and you think, aha, that's it then. So if you pay attention to the world as a machine, only the machine-like aspects of the world come to your attention, and you think the machine has done a very good job of understanding the world. But all the things that are not mechanical have been lost, and they may turn out to be by far the most important aspects of the world and of our experience in life. So I refer at the end, because I find it useful to do so, to the philosopher who's worked more on values than anybody in the last few hundred years, who is the German phenomenological philosopher Max Scheler. And he has this hierarchy of values which forms, if you like, a pyramid. And it's the only thing, actually, I think, that I repeat from The Master and His Emissary through to this newer book. Because I just think it's so essential that he divides values into certain well, I think I've talked about this before. Maybe I shouldn't go into it again.
Well, it's worth repeating. It's not
okay.
to take for granted.
Very briefly, he thinks that values occupy different tiers, and at the bottom there are those of utility and pleasure. And then above those come what he called Lebenswerte, which are the values of life, such as magnanimity, courage, loyalty, humility. Then there are what he calls geistige Werte. Geistig is interesting in German because Geist means both intellect and spirit. And these would be probably beauty, truth and goodness, the good old Platonic virtues, which we don't respect anything like as much as we ought. And above them is das Heilige, which is almost unapproachable, the holy. And the way we've been taught is to view this hierarchy upside down, that everything really only exists to contribute to utility and pleasure. That the holy is a fiction created by a priestly caste in order to exert power over people. That beauty, goodness and truth are really derived from evolutionary demands and are simply about assortative mating. Or something of the kind. It's not a coherent argument. I think I've dealt with that before. That the Lebenswerte, the values of, what we would call sort of being a decent person, are those that people who are foolish enough to do so adopt in order to sacrifice their own well-being for society, and that all that really matters in the end is the values of utility. And that is the world in which we now live. And I was very struck by Roger Sperry, who of course has been to me a mentor, though I never met him, but I have read pretty much everything he wrote. And he was a very powerful mind. Interestingly, he came to science from a humanities background, as did I, and I think that's important, and was therefore able to see what he discovered about the brain in a much broader concept than would normally be the case for a neuroscientist. But he emphasized that what was going wrong in his time was to do with values, and that unless we were able to recalibrate our allegiance to certain values, we wouldn't survive.
And there's a word you use also in describing how that may happen, which is to be possessed by those values, which I find very interesting, because it's not just an act of will, but there's something about receptivity, even grace, in those values repossessing us.
Yes, I didn't know that I said that. And
well, you use the word possess, and I say all the rest. No, I'm saying all the rest.
No, okay. I maybe didn't express it quite in that way, but I think that, yes, to live, to inhabit these values, they're not just something you intellectually sign up to.
Yes.
They're something that you adopt, and it guides one's being. Ultimately, what I'm talking about in these books is ways of being in the world. I mean, that's the best way to sum it up, because other versions are thinking differently, feeling differently, and so on. But neither of those and others are really enough. It's to do with a way, which is a very important word, of being in the world. And that way emphasizes the how, the manner in which we live, which is really important in pretty much every spiritual tradition.
Yes.
In other words, somebody comes to me and says, how do I become a Buddhist? I don't just say, well, you stop eating meat, and you sit cross-legged, and you meditate for half an hour or whatever. I mean, that's not it at all. It's you take into your life a way of relating to the world and of living in it as a human being. And it's that changes. The other things are signs, and they are the external correspondences to it, but they're not the thing itself.
Yes, and it reminds me of what we were discussing a few minutes ago about, well, I put it this way, those entities being more than just ideas. This is not a market of better ideas only. It's also there are these entities, and we reach towards them, and maybe they possess them. At least that's how I understood it, and that creates this new way, or maybe old way recovered of being in the world.
What I want to do is to express, using, of course, ideas and images, and basing what I have to say soundly on science and reason, a new way of thinking about what we're doing, who we are, why we're here, and what life is, what the world is. And so, yes, it's not just about ideas, although it contains, I hope, a great deal of ideas. And sometimes it's only possible to captivate people's interest and their imagination by talking to them in the way in which they are used to talking. And what I've hoped to do is go all the way towards people who don't normally think in the ways I'm hoping that I will lead people to think, and saying, on the basis of the way you think about the world, can I talk to you in your terms? And let us see if something follows.
Now, we've covered the whole book. You've obviously written it. I've obviously read it. And we've discussed it. Some people may still be wherever they are, and that's fine. But I want to ask you about beyond the matter with things, or after the matter with things, or epilogos, the matter with things. Where do you see it going? Noting two things here. One is that books take a life of their own. That's one thing.
They do, yes.
And the other being that, well, you, at some point you need to finish it and say, well, up to here I've said what I need to say, but the process continues, right? So I'm
Yes.
very curious, even if it's just a glimpse or an intuition of where you think the book is going and where are you going.
Well, I see my part as being part of a flowing whole, as all human beings are. They are, as Edmund Burke saw, this wonderful 18th century politician, that we are one with the people who came before us and those who come after us. And to use a sort of rather banal image, I suppose one could talk about life as a sort of a relay in which something is given and something is passed. And all I really want to do is to do that bit as well as I can. At the end of the book, I do quote Angela Silesius, this German 17th century German poet, philosopher, mystic and physician, who says, you know, that's surely enough, but if you want more, then go and be yourself the word and yourself the being. And so what I'm really doing is saying to people to take in, if they will, what I've said, and to do with it what they will, because they will see more than I can see. I can't see the way for everything. I can only see what I can see. So I want other people to take up what I've been able to put forward the best I can, and run with it, as we now say, but to take it forward and expand and expound it. And I can't predict where exactly that will go, but I know from reactions of people already, and this is something I'd never anticipated, is the extraordinary number of people who do, bless them, write to me and say, you know, your work has changed my life. Now, I can't ask more than that, really.
Yeah.
And I think also that everything is a process and is continuous. And so I can't say I'm going to wrap things up, because this is an ongoing melody, if you like. It's, yeah.
Now, if I recall, David Lorimer has reviewed your book in a very generous and accurate way, I would say. And he says the following thing. He says something like, well, your work, this book in particular, is comparable to William James' Principles of Psychology, and also that your work is, does he use this word, the most profound or seminal work since Alfred North Whitehead, Process and Reality. And I know you'll be humble and say, well, that's an exaggeration, but what do you make of those comments, really? I mean, without being Ian McGilchrist right now, how would you judge the importance of your book? And you don't need to be unnecessarily humble.
Well, no, I can't say. Obviously, I'm very grateful for David's kindness. But I would hope that what I've done is be able to take, in my own way, ideas of greater people like James and Whitehead and recast them. What I've been able to do is to add an enormous amount, 400 pages of hard neuroscience to this, and show how, on any basis, this philosophy that I think they share, and so with other figures like Bergson and the phenomenological philosophers, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Scheler, Wittgenstein, in fact, all of these, this very important body of philosophy which shares certain things, and none of these people are identical to one another, how this actually is absolutely in keeping with what we know scientifically about the most important part of us that we can examine scientifically in relation to philosophy, namely the human brain. And I've synthesized that with the philosophy and with my best understanding of other traditions of wisdom. And what I believe I've found is that these come together, that these, however disparate these ideas seem to be, neuroscience over here, philosophy here, and physics, in fact, over here, that what we know from these things coheres on a reality which is also honoured anciently by many peoples around the world. Now that, to me, suggests that if you're going to dismiss it, you're risking being blind to something pretty important, and before dismissing it, you need to have very good reasons for showing why it's wrong. Yeah. So I'm always open, this is how things progress, being told I've got it wrong. But I'm hoping that to some degree I've helped to shift, or may in the future help to shift, the way in which people think about the world.
I'm pretty sure you've got it better.
and make it better.
Or got it better and make it better. I wanted to ask about you yourself, because there's the young Darwin and there's the more later one, and as I understand, he was dried out by the amount of facts and data that his mind was able to synthesize, and we know what a synthesis that was. But as he himself recognizes at some point, he wasn't interested in poetry anymore.
That's right.
Well, how have you suffered your own writing of this beast?
It's a good question, thank you. I mean, yes, he said, I feel that my mind has become a mill for grinding out facts, and that if I had my life to lead again, I would make sure that I spent some part of the week reading poets and so on, listening to music. Well, what can I say? Poetry and music are to me, with a sense of the spiritual, the most important things in my life. And thank God I haven't lost the beauty of them. But for a while in writing, I was so intent on what I was thinking that I did feel as though I was, to a degree, possessed by an unyielding and unfriendly spirit that just said, no, you've got to carry on with this and get writing again. And so I didn't as much as I should have done for a while, and I think I did suffer. I think it took me a year after finishing it really to sort of get back on track. But one of the nice things was that during lockdown I thought that I would I don't know why the idea came to me. I'm going to read a poem or poems every day for the whole of the next year. And that gave me huge pleasure, even if it didn't to anyone else. I just loved reuniting myself with the poems, the great poems that are just essential to enjoying life for me. And listening. I must spend more time listening to music now that I've finished the hard grind. There are times in life, aren't there, when we must set things aside and grind. I mean, there was a time in my life when I was working 120 hours a week. It's just no longer legal. But it was legal